Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. I am pleased to have Dr. Bill Kreuser, the president of GreenKeeper, joining me again. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be back.
You have been on the show 3 or 4 times now, and every time we have a very interesting and semi-technical discussion about some turfgrass topics. And I wrote a blog post a couple weeks ago about sand in clippings, and I referenced an article that you wrote from some research that you did 15 years or so ago about taking sand out of clippings. And since we both think that measuring the growth or making some type of rapid assessment of how much the grass is growing can be really useful in improving turfgrass conditions and improving the efficiency of the work done to produce turfgrass conditions. And because of your familiarity with the impact of sand, I thought, what better person to talk about with that than you? So I'll bring up that blog post on the screen now. And that blog post has a title, Sand in Clippings. Have you read this one?
I did. Yep.
And I will put a direct link to this in the show notes so everybody can check it out, because there is a particular chart in there that shows just how dramatic the error is when you have sand in the clippings. But the best way to minimize that is to not have sand in the clippings. Do you ever find that possible, or does sand just somehow get into the clippings no matter what you do?
Yeah, it does tend to get in the clippings no matter what. Total quantity is very, it depends from day to day, but we're collecting thousands of clippings a day with our clipping PGR research, and we always had to clean the sand out of the clippings for that type of research. And I even had some plots. I was reviewing some of our old data where we plotted the distribution of sand contamination across putting greens. And some areas might be as low as a few percent by weight, and in other areas could be as high as 30% of the weight of a sample resulting from sand. So we would try things like, hey, we're going to really minimize top dressing and minimizing cultivation, no verticutting, no grooming, nothing like that during clipping collection periods, and we would still have to account for the sand. And so as a result, we just said, this is not a method that people should be using, which is to weigh the clippings because of the sand contamination issues. And that's why we really liked what you were proposing when it came to measuring volume versus the weight to help to minimize that error.
And you were doing dried clippings, which just absolutely magnifies the error. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's about a 10x difference in density. So I was looking at a chart from my paper. So even if there was like 3% of a sample was by volume was sand, that constituted about 25% of the weight of that sample.
Yeah.
So very small quantities of sand can constitute a huge weight. And so that was a massive limitation to using weight and just not saying, oh, I don't have to clean clippings. No, a 1 or 2% by volume, which is just even seeing a couple of pieces of sand in dried clippings. That's enough to have a huge impact, especially when you're looking at PGRs that might be suppressing growth rate by 5, 10, 15%. If you have a few grains of sand in those samples, or seemingly a few grains of sand, that's going to really skew the results of that research.
That's right. So we jumped ahead to talk about your research looking at how much the grass is growing, and the standard way to measure clipping yield, the standard way to measure how much grass is growing is mass of dried clippings, or the weight of dried material cut off the surface per area. That's pretty much the yield for any type of crop. It's how much mass of apples, or mass of bentgrass seed, or mass of ryegrass seed harvested, or mass of hay, or mass of dried clippings that comes off an area. That's always the standard, and that's why I think everybody just kind of discounted volume for so long because nobody realized that volume, when you look at it over time, is quite closely correlated with what the dry weight of the clippings would be. So there's so much research that's done, and people say that they measure clipping yield on their research plots, and they do something like they take a sample once a month or take a sample twice in the summer. Most of the time they'll cut the grass and throw it in the garbage, but every now and then they'll say, "Oh, we're going to go check the yield on these plots," and they'll go mow it. But with the ease of doing clipping volume, you can do this in everyday maintenance. You can also apply it in research because it's possible now to more easily check all the clippings and actually measure how much the grass is growing. So the nice thing about volume is it still has error when it has sand in it, because that sand obviously is occupying space that is not occupied by clippings, but it minimizes the error so much by looking at it in volume instead of looking at it in mass, because the density of sand and clippings is so different.
Yeah, exactly. And there's other factors that are involved too that make volume better. But I think dry clipping weight and measuring clippings daily is really important for things like wetting modeling growth regulators or a fertilizer response in a research setting. But it's just not practical when you have to think about having drying ovens and analytical balances that cost lots of money, and then just the sheer amount of labor to get every piece of sand out of those samples. So it only makes sense in a research setting when you really need to have precise measurements on biomass production and removal. And then on top of that too, even this whole process is just messy, right? We're collecting clippings with a device really not designed to analytically measure clipping removal, which is
No
a greens
kidding.
mower, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
stuff throwing around, sticking here or there, and then there's also considerations like the aggressiveness of the real life, bed knife placement. All of those things are going to be really important, and so like any kind of data collection, it's all about this being consistent in how you're monitoring and measuring, and clipping volume is an easy way to get a really good feel for how much growth there is in a fairly analytical way that isn't as insane as what's required in a high-end research R&D scenario.
Very good. Let me show the blog post chart and show how that difference in density leads to. Well, first I'll show a picture that shows at home when I was doing a research project in Thailand looking at leaf nutrient content. So I was collecting clippings from paspalum greens, from Bermuda greens, from zoysia greens, and checking the average leaf nutrient content. And so I asked the superintendents to give me a sample from the greens mow that morning. I was shocked at the amount of sand in some of the clippings. And so I had to rinse them, and rinsing doesn't remove all the sand, but generally the clippings will float in the water or on top of the water a little bit, and the sand generally will fall down to the bottom if you put it in a container and stir it. And so through that, you're able to separate by gravity the clippings from the sand a little bit. But you wrote in your research that that did not separate the sand well enough even for research purposes, did it?
It didn't. It was still pretty good, and a lot of the variability came in. Like you're losing some clippings. You're leaching out a little nutrient level, but very, very low. The more the variability came in, and how then you collected and dried. And so what we would do is then put them into a large, like lab grade paper towel, essentially, and we would take the mass of that, then dump the clippings into that towel to kind of capture them, and then weigh the clippings in the towel. And so there was just some other sources of error there with like the drying and the handling of those individual towels. And again, it was slow. And I wanted to say, if you are thinking about doing rinsing, if you do have a sample like that though, and you want to send it in for tissue sampling or testing, That is a fine approach to float them and just get off what you need, because you're not really measuring yield there. You're looking at the tissue levels, and we found that if we used standard tap water with different minerals in it, that the values were pretty consistent or pretty similar to if we would have cleaned them without washing them and just removed the sand more manually. It's only when we used distilled water, deionized water, that's very low ionic strength, that we would actually leach some of the nutrient out of those leaves more easily during that cleaning process. So if you are going to be submitting a sample and it does have sand and you want to kind of float the clippings off, harvest them and dry them in some towel and send them off, just make sure you use standard tap water. Don't try to overcomplicate it and get some deionized clean water, because actually that can introduce more error in the measurement.
That's interesting. I think at labs, when they do it, they would tend to use deionized water. So that sounds like a good research project to check that.
Yeah, we tested all kinds of different ionic strengths to see what would happen, and the higher the ionic strength, the better. So maybe in a lab scenario, you would consider adding a salt that's not a typical nutrient, just to help to keep the tissue more intact during that cleaning process.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I've always
I think a lot about clippings.
Yeah,
Since 2008.
I generally don't like washing clippings because an element like potassium that's soluble. I think about potassium a lot, and potassium is not really a component of any molecules in the plant, is it? It's just
No,
just
and that's the
soluble,
one that
right?
leaches.
So
Yeah, that's the one that had the highest leaching levels.
and so I'm always concerned, like, well, if you wash it too much, you might deplete the potassium in the leaf. So I prefer to keep it unwashed. But then you have the concern, if you have the sand contamination, then it makes it impossible to analyze. For various reasons, I don't really like clipping. I don't like routine measurement of clippings, and I've written about that quite a bit on the ATC website. But for research purposes, I do it quite a bit, and it's a tricky kind of thing. If you're making decisions about it for fertilizer, I think that's probably not the best way to decide what type of fertilizer to apply. But anyway, yeah, clippings. I'm doing a research project now where I'm asking everybody just to standardize this. We're all washing the clippings and then drying them and then sending them to the lab and then giving the lab instructions to not wash them a second time. So you certainly would run into problems if you wash the clippings yourself, and then if it got washed again at the lab, that would be problematic too, especially if the clippings were dry when they're washed the second time, which I think could lead to all kinds of loss of elements that are no longer part of the same structure.
Yeah, that's definitely
they were.
true. Once the clippings were dried and washed, we didn't even kind of include that in the analysis. But yeah, if you dry the clippings first and then wash them, you're going to have very different numbers than if they're wet or fresh, or if they are dried and then cleaned without water. So definitely some concern there. And also too, drying them that alone is not an easy thing to think about, because if they get too hot and you're interested in nitrogen, you'll start losing nitrogen from those leaves. So your oven can't get much above 60 Celsius before you can potentially start introducing other air. So, in a research setting, we put our clippings into a drying oven at about 55 degrees Celsius, and they let them sit there for about 24 to 36 hours, depending on how many clippings are in a sample. And that's kind of the well-to-do way of how to dry your clippings down without losing some of the nitrogen level in those leaves.
Yeah, so don't put it in a microwave then to dry.
I've never tested it, so maybe that would be such a flash heat up, it would be fine. I don't know.
Yeah,
So I would
yeah,
I'd be reluctant.
Yeah, I don't. I think sticking with standard, safe ways with clippings is probably the recommended way to do it. So anyway, I showed this picture, and there's just a huge amount of sand. And anyway, so you can separate the clippings out, but that sand, if I was trying to measure the clipping yield, and I've got even a fraction of that amount of sand in the clippings, it's going to have a huge amount of error. And I thought, you know what? I've got a bunch of data on this, and I can actually just, from the measurements that I've made, I know what the bulk densities are of the sand and of the fresh, clean clippings. So I can plot this. So I made a chart, and I put a link in here to the paper that that you can go to, that Bill was the lead author on. It's a title is "Removing Sand from Putting Green Clipping Samples Substantially Reduces Clipping Weight Measurement Error." So there's a link to that in this blog post. And then down at the bottom, I put the chart that I've got up on the screen now. And for those of you who are listening to this, if you're interested, please go and check it out. I even went to the trouble of putting two x-axes across the top. It's teaspoons of sand per quart of fresh clippings. And at the bottom, it's the unit that I would typically use, which is cubic centimeter or milliliter of sand per liter of fresh clippings. And on the vertical y-axis, it is the percentage error, the error that you have in the clipping mass that is caused by that sand. And there's one line that goes up a lot more rapidly than the other. And you can get, basically, once you have 2 teaspoons of clippings, or 10 milliliters of 2 teaspoons of sand, or 10 milliliters of sand per quart or per liter in your clippings, you're going to have about 5% error by mass on the fresh weight. And on the dry weight, that's going to be even worse. And that's
Let's
only...
just stop with that for a sec. So I actually appreciate the teaspoon analogy, because I think 10 cubic centimeters, although it's a good unit, it's easy to work with. I think everybody can visualize a quart or maybe even a cubic liter or a liter. But then thinking about teaspoons, I mean, it's such a small quantity when you're baking, and put that into a quart of flour or something. Yet just thinking about that in a baking perspective, it really shows what a dramatic change that can be from just a small amount of material. So
Yeah.
I kind of like the teaspoon, because I can think of that as in baking instructions really, really quickly.
Yeah, I agree. And I thought it was nice in teaspoon, because 10 milliliters sounds like a lot, but this is a beaker that's 100 milliliters at that top line, and this bottom line here, this is 20. So 10 is just the bottom of this little tiny beaker. But a teaspoon is even easier, because that's something that you put some sugar into your tea, or you use it to put some baking powder into a cookie mix or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just a tiny little spoon, and that quickly gives you 5% error if you just have a couple of those. And the samples that I've seen that are actually collected from golf course putting greens, they often have that amount of sand in them, unfortunately. So that chart shows what the error is.
I'd venture to guess in that picture that you posted that it was at least 60% volume sand.
What
What would your guess be?
In this,
The last slide, the last one that had all the sandy sample.
well, that's after I took the clippings out.
Okay, that was the remaining.
Yeah, that was at the remaining. But if you would have looked at what it was before, maybe, by volume, it would be, probably close to 50. I've had some that it was definitely more sand than clippings. And I know some people do that as a badge of honor, that they've restricted the growth so much, or they're kind of like, they feel like they've got the growth rate just right when they're collecting more sand than they are grass. That's not the way
I would say
I want
that's
to manage,
probably...
but I know some people
I,
manage like that.
I'd say then that's probably a sign of over top dressing, right? If your growth rate is so low, then you're probably in excess on the top dressing side. If you're not, ideally, you'd almost, I think you want to try to match that sand addition with growth rate. And if your growth rate is so low that you're getting more sand off than clippings all the time, I mean, good for you. First of all, you probably don't have that much traffic to handle that level of growth. But it does seem like maybe the top dressing level is maybe a little bit high if your ratios were constantly that different.
Do you, I'm going to change the subject a little bit and ask, because I've heard you talk about how people should adjust their growth regulators or adjust their growth basically based on
Mm-hmm.
how much the grass is growing. So, if I understand correctly, you would recommend people to the turf grass managers, you would recommend they measure the clippings, they use that measurement of the clippings to give an indication of how much the grass is growing. They have some idea of how much they want the grass to be growing. And then you can adjust your fertilizer or your water or your growth regulators to move the growth in the direction that you want it to be. Do is that an accurate statement of how you think people should manage? And then if not, please correct it. And then
No,
tell
that's
me,
exactly right.
do people actually do that? Or are people
Yeah,
on so much of programs that they don't make the adjustments?
I think people are starting to do it. There's definitely people out there that do it. Um, I tend to use the PGR as more of the brake pedal because the fertility responses are slower. They're harder to really like to gauge. And sometimes if you have a low growth rate, it's because it's environmental, right? It's a low growth potential environment. And so you could put fertilizer on and not really see a big increase in growth rate. If you look at growth potential and your growth rate should be high and it's low, well, then that is a sign that maybe you're lean and you could consider stimulating some more of that growth with fertilizer. So if you're looking for a quicker response to adjust growth rate, PGRs are really it. And because the duration of these products is temperature dependent, and for the most part, even though you have changes in weather, day to day, the climate data, even in places like Nebraska, is fairly consistent. So you can still schedule out your PGRs with broader intervals in the spring and the fall, and then tighten them up in the summer. But then what I want to do is adjust my PGR rates and combinations to try to get my clipping volume to be at a level that I think is sustainable. And for me, when I was taking care of the par 3 course, that number seemed to be between zero point 0.8 and 1.25 quarts per thousand or liters per 100 square meters,
Okay.
or for
I'm
your
going to
unit be 80 to 120, right? So,
Okay, can you tell me that again? Because that's not the unit that I usually use, and you were talking
yep.
quickly. So,
So
what was that? And now it's not for everybody, but when you were managing the par 3 course, what number were you typically shooting for?
So I'm shooting for 1 quart per thousand on average,
Mm-hmm.
which is 1 liter per 100 square meters or 10 milliliters per meter, right?
And that's the number that I like because we don't
Yep.
have to use decimal points. So
Yep.
I like the last one. Just say we're growing at 10.
I get it. But, when then people in the US hate thinking about anything metric. And so a quart's really simple and I can't do hundreds of quarts easily. So, or I'm not going to do fluid ounces. Then it gets, the units aren't as even. So I think it's easy to do. If you're going to be US, you do quarts. If you want to be metric, you can do liters or milliliters because they're so equivalent with each other that we're at least we're at an order of magnitude different, but we're not like 128 fluid ounces or 60. We're not getting into that. So that's where it's like I like those units because no matter if you really want to focus on one or the other, they're essentially equivalent with each other. So 1 quart or 10 milliliters was kind of my area. And so when I'd see my growth rate slowing down, I would start pulling the PGRs back. And if the grow potential was high, that I thought it should be growing more, then I would fertilize a little bit more to help stimulate some extra growth. And so the program that I used to use would be like a new which is peroxidine calcium. I'd schedule it out at 250 growing degree day intervals. I would do that right away in the spring with some proxy for seed head control. And then as the growth rate starts to increase, I would introduce Trimit 2SC, paclobutrazol, started at a 4-ounce rate. That minimizes the risk of a phyto because the first application, regardless of the time of the year, you're going to see phyto out of the Class B PGRs. Start at a 4-ounce rate and then just start working your way up depending on what your clipping volume is telling you. So in the middle of the summer, mineralization is great. It's hot, it's humid. I would be up at the full rate of the Anu and the Paclo to try to suppress that growth rate. So I'm being flexible, but I'm still kind of looking at my growing degree days to know when do I need to reapply. So application rate impacts how much suppression you're getting. Temperature impacts how long an individual PGR is lasting. And actually, even in my last year there, we separated them, the Anu and the Trimit, because Anu was foliar uptake, Trimit's root. And so I would make the Anu applications kind of alternating with the fertility, wetting agents, Pythium root rot, root diseases, paclobutrazol. And so they were kind of at the middle of the year, they were almost every few days you do one foliar app, then you do a watering app, and it led to a really nice, consistent growth suppression. And then again, I would just constantly be adjusting those rates based on where my clippings were telling me the grass growth rate was going. And as a result, the greens that summer were between, about 10.5 at the low to about 12.5 every single day, because we were really managing that growth rate and keeping it at a level that was able to handle 30,000 rounds of golf, but also provide a good playing surface. So that's kind of my little quick aside on PGRs and how I use clipping volume to schedule those applications.
Okay. Thank you. That is a lot to take in, and I understand it. I think in my mind, I'm sitting here thinking I understand that because I've heard that. We've had this conversation a few times before, and you've explained that to me a few times, and I understand it. If somebody's hearing it for the first time and is not so accustomed to that type of management, they may want to listen to that again because that seems like that's a very modern way to manage. And I think, 10 years ago, it wasn't so common for people to measure clippings and to know how much the grass grew today, how much it grew last week, how much it grew last month. And if you've been doing this for a couple years, you also know, wait a second, last June, you could say last June we were growing 120% more than we are now. So you can have so much information, and then you can make adjustments with a lot more insight, I think. So it seems to me that this is a nice tool. And I just wanted to ask if you think people are doing it the way that you just described. Is it common?
Definitely. I mean, that's why we're seeing the rise in people doing it in GreenKeeper, because it's giving them that feedback. So if we know today that you had, say, 10 milliliters of clippings and you have 50% suppression, you go into GreenKeeper and it says estimated clippings without a PGR would have been 20. So then you know that you're hitting the right level of suppression. So it's serving as like a control plot without having to actually have one in the field. If your clipping volume was like 1.5% or 15 milliliters, and you want it to be 1, and you're at 50% suppression, then maybe instead of being at 50% suppression, you want to be at 67% suppression, right? So it's giving you some of that feedback, and so you're still programmatic. You can still schedule your applications, but when you're scheduling your apps, when it's the day to make the application, then decide on the rate, right? That's what I want people to do. You can schedule all your PGRs. You can use growing degree day intervals if you want to, like, really dial those in. But more importantly, just put a placeholder rate in your calendar. And when that day comes that you have to spray, decide, do I need 2 PGRs in the tank or 1? Do I want to use a high rate, a low rate? Be flexible and let your clipping volume be your guide to make that decision when you're going to do the next PGR app.
Little technical difficulty, but I'm going to ask the question that I started to ask you. I've got a couple questions about PGRs that I didn't plan to ask, but it came to mind that people have asked me. One was a question, Does Primo increase rooting?
I would say it sustains rooting. You're going to start your year off with a healthy root system, generally coming out of a lower stress period, and you're going to move into a higher stress period. And during that higher stress, through reallocation of sugar that would have went to clipping production, we can see that there's more energy available in that plant to sustain roots, which require energy to live in that dark, murky world of the soil. But then also there's research to show that it potentially helps out with stress hormones that continue to keep roots healthy and then also start new root initiation. So it doesn't really increase rooting. So I think that a good Primo program will sustain rooting during stressful periods. And so it's a reason to be on it, but it's not going to primarily increase rooting. And that might probably fine in a non-stress environment, but it is really important when that plant's under stress to sustain those roots.
And then if it does do that, then over the long term, and this is the second question I was going to ask, wouldn't it make sense that the regular use of plant growth regulators like Primo would increase the accumulation of organic material in the soil?
Yeah, and I guess to go back to the rooting part to answer that first part is when we overregulated the turf and we did bent grass in October on summer intervals. This is my first PGR study. We reduced the root depth and mass by over 50% with Primo. And so it kind of comes back to trying to manage towards an ideal growth rate. And if you overdo the PGRs, then you can lead to some problems in rooting. I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Well, that wasn't quite what my question was, because
Yeah.
you overdo. If you overdo it, you suppress the roots. But my question is, if you apply it at the rate that's going to optimize plant health over a multi-year period,
Yes.
wouldn't that increase the organic material in the soil, or increase the accumulation rate of organic material in the soil compared with not applying a growth regulator? That's the question.
Yeah, and that's where I was going, and I just completely lost it. So if you were on a normal scenario where you were managing your growth rate effectively, again, if the PGRs are just sustaining rooting that's there, well, those roots are still there anyways. It's not like it made more roots. But the flip side of that was in 2021, when we took this approach of let's intentionally try to overregulate the greens at agar, and we were at like 70+% suppression year long. Well, our clipping volume was going really, really low. It was somewhere around 50 milliliters or half of a quart. And that was causing problems with traffic recovery. So we ended up putting down 3 pounds of nitrogen that year to keep the growth and the color and the density where it needed to be to handle that suppression. Well, what did that lead to? It led to we removed about 3/4 of a quart or 3/4 of a pound of nitrogen fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. And we had to put 3 pounds down, 3.3 pounds down, actually. So we put down 5 times more fertilizer than we took off. And what was the end result? It was an end result of rapid accumulation of organic matter in the top inch. In 2022 and on, when we were trying to manage our PGRs and our fertilizers around clipping volume, where clipping volume was the tool, then we were in a much more sustainable scenario where we weren't having these rapid increases in organic matter management. So it required less top dressing, less cultivation. And so now we're taking data in, we're making small adjustments in the program. We're not using this brute force approach that then led to the need to have to add more sand and more cultivation. And that kind of goes to my comment before about if your growth rate's so low and you're over top dressing, that's the other side of that scenario where, do you need to be doing that? How can we use clipping volume? How can we use organic matter testing, either in a 246 or even just in those top 2 centimeters to get a snapshot of what is going on with our cultivation and how do all those agronomic practices link together?
Thank you. That is good information. So I think the answers that I was telling people were generally correct. If I'm saying that there's not really strong evidence to just say if you want to stimulate roots, you don't go make a growth regulator application, but you can imagine certain scenarios in which you could have more roots with a regular growth regulator application than without it, right?
And I
So
think I think we mentioned this in maybe our last episode, but again, I had a shady green that in the spring was trying to outgrow the oak trees around it. And so we saw a 50% increase in growth rate, which means that we were removing fertilizers and sugars at 50% higher rate. And so that's nutrient and that's sugar that's not available to sustain rooting. And so in that scenario in the spring, when we saw those clipping volume trends, we would apply extra PGRs on the shady greens to try to check that. And then when we got into August and the sugar levels in the plant are critically low and the growth rate slowing, the density is rapidly declining. Well, then we'd only treat that green with one of the two PGRs in my cocktail of spray because it's already growing slowly and doesn't need it. And aggressive PGR in that scenario might further exacerbate problems of loss of rooting, right? So we got to be flexible. That's where clipping volume is really important. And when we get things in a normal state, we have the best chance of surviving stress and longevity and not leading to rapid changes in organic matter levels.
how much do you see people doing green by green management with different top dressing rates, different fertilizer rates, and different PGRs on different greens or different sections of greens?
Not very common, and I that's important thing, and I think with clipping volume too, that's important. If you're not going to manage all of your greens differently, it doesn't make sense to measure every single green every single day. It's kind of like dieting, and you decide I'm going to lose 15 pounds, I'm going to eat 500 calories a day and work out 4 hours, right? If you're going to go into it that much, and that's just a hard routine to set for yourself. You want to make small changes that are easy to push onto your crew. And so measuring, some representative greens, if you're going to manage them all the same, then that's fine. Maybe you measure all the greens one day to get an idea of what the ranges look like across the golf course. But in everyday management, find a couple representative greens that you're going to manage towards. And so for me, we had our full sun greens. And so that was 8 of the 10 greens. And then we had 2 that were shady. So I did clippings from one of the full sun greens and one of the shady greens. And then I would manage those 2 differently. And it's not uncommon, right? The shady greens too, we would start walk mowing in the spring, in the fall when they're thinning out. We saw a positive improvement. We might raise the height on those areas. And so if you're at the point where you're seeing grass thinning out and dying and you're getting some pressure on you that you are going to have to manage it differently, well, then make sure you're capturing the data in that microclimate too to justify all the inputs and the work you're putting into those spots.
Is there any progress being made in automation of measuring how much the grass is growing instead of dumping clippings into buckets? Because you'll remember that when this was getting started, a lot of people instantly want to automate it with lasers or, various automatic weight measurements and so on. Is there progress in that area?
I haven't heard too much, and so it's a tough nut to crack. With the sand contamination, the various levels of dew and moisture from day to day, I think that probably has limited some of the development. But fingers crossed that hopefully we can do something at some point here. And then even like the crop sensors that we've been investing in fairways, we correlated those values to clipping volumes in fairways, an area you're not going to actually go measure clippings. And so we can, a rough correlation under a healthy climate where we don't have pests or something, that there's going to be a positive correlation to NDRE, NDVI, especially NDRE, which is a vegetative index that is highly correlated to nitrogen. Nitrogen status is highly correlated to growth rate. So if we can get an estimate of what the NDRE value is, we can get a pretty good assumption of what the growth rate is. Again, given that there's not disease or other types of stresses that might be hindering that growth.
Or drought stress?
Drought stress, exactly. Because NDRE, until the grass is really, really wilting, is pretty continuous across different levels of low levels of stress. So you could have a scenario where you could have a well fertilized piece of grass. The NDRE value could be high, but the NDVI, which is the greenness or the density, starts to go off, and that would be a signal that a computer would say, okay, this area doesn't need more fertilizer, it needs more water. And so those are some of the decision trees that our research team at GreenKeeper is trying to understand and build into our software.
Speaking of the software, I remember that we talked about two things in the last couple of episodes, and I wanted to get an update on those from you. One of
Sure.
them was growing degree day breakdown and reapplication for soil surfactants. And I wondered how that project is going. I think we talked about this a year ago, and I was really excited about that, and you were really excited about that, but I haven't heard a lot over the past year. Can you give me an update on how that's going?
Yeah. So we did 2 field studies this year, pretty large. The data is on my agenda to be analyzed the next 2 weeks. But the first study looked at various soil surfactants, pretty common industry ones. And we applied them to the greens at Agar. We actually split all the greens in half. And so every half of a green was on a different wetting agent at the standard kind of high rate on the label. Don't have any of the data analyzed yet. It takes a long time. We've got all our water drop penetration tests all done and organized, and that was also replicated at Arkansas. And so we'll have some more information on that. And then also this year, in a more small scale research trial, we did various rates of one of the wetting agents, Counteract Firm from Simplot, that was the initial wetting agent we modeled, to understand how does application rate influence the duration and the effects of a wetting agent. And when I mean the effects, it's really how uniform is the wettability of the cores that we pull from those greens. So if we use a higher rate, do we see even greater levels of uniformity in how long it takes for a drop of water to infiltrate any given core that we pull from that green? So
If I
I wish I had more information for you right now, but I'm sure you're going to hear about it in some upcoming blog articles in the next few weeks as we get the data all analyzed.
So knowing what you know now, you don't have the data analyzed from this year, so you don't really have anything new to update.
Nothing new. Yep. So we still we're excited to finally get into analyzing these data. So we got the weather data finally, and so now we are bringing it all together to do the modeling.
Okay. So let's just say if I'm in Dubai and I don't think it's going to rain for the next 6 months and I'm on sandy soil and I'm going to be irrigating, do you have some advice on how I could look at reapplication of soil surfactants? Is there a based on what you already know, not updated?
Yeah, I think the thing that we need to think about is that changes in temperature are going to dramatically alter how long these products are going to last. I think Dubai is probably the bad scenario because it's probably pretty warm more uniformly. And even if there is some fluctuation between, say, 25°C and
40?
40°C, yeah, like that's not a huge change because the base temperature on these models is 7 Celsius. It's going to be more in climates like they're temperate, where we start to get air temperatures approaching, 10°C, 12°C, that when you're taking 7 degrees of base temperature off, then the models really start to stretch out. And so we can see reapplication intervals as the soils start to approach 7 degrees Celsius or 45 Fahrenheit, where the intervals can go, 120 days. Like a climate like Nebraska, we go 120 days and then go down to about a 16-day interval in the middle of July and then back to 120-day. So if you're scheduling your surfactants, think about it like a growth regulator and understand that when those temperatures are increasing, microbial activity is at a higher level, and potentially we need to be applying it at a much tighter frequency in the heat of the summer.
Thank you. Now, how about the irrigation or the soil moisture prediction tool where you know the soil moisture, you know the ET and the forecast ET, and from that you can predict when irrigation will be required? How is that working out after implementing that in the app for, 6 months or so? When are we
Yeah,
talk in May, right? So,
yeah.
so
So
something
we've
like that.
that's been a bit. So this summer, me and my staff would go to a couple courses in Lincoln and take hundreds of TDR measurements across fairways. And then we would and we do it between the sprinkler heads, and instead of thinking about running individual heads, we're thinking about how do we optimize irrigation in the individual zones that all the heads overlap. And so one of the parts of that research was on the fairway side, how do we optimize the sprinkler head run times to, water only the areas that need it, but then also not let areas go and become wilted. And so that's been a huge part of my active research has been actually in irrigation scheduling. And on the other part of that research, we've been then also going to a couple greens, and we would take 15 measurements from those greens every day, and we put how many minutes of irrigation went down, and then we let GreenKeeper's machine learning models figure out what the crop coefficients and root depths and all of the other factors that would go into that to then predict is that green going to dry down every hour throughout the day. And so we're using hourly ET, we're using these different factors. And the coolest thing about it was through routine measurements. If you measure that same green every day and the model thinks it should be at 19%, but then you measure and it's at 20%, it starts a rolling average refinement on those coefficients through these machine learning processes to understand how is that green using moisture within this current day, looking back over the last 30 days of changes. And so the models become really, really precise. And so generally our predictions from day to day, we're within less than 0.5% soil moisture. So if we think it's going to be 18% tomorrow morning and we go measure, it's going to be 18.3% or 18.5%. That's how precise these models become. And it's just by you giving it the average moisture every day, it then starts to learn. And so, we talk about crop coefficients being 80%. Well, that depends on a lot of things like airflow. Is the green facing southwest or is it facing north? What's the soil like? Is there shade issues there? So every green's going to have its own crop coefficient,
Mm-hmm.
and these models figure that out for you, and then show you how much water you should put down tonight to prevent wilt at 4 p.m. tomorrow.
And that's something that you were making these measurements, but that's already built into the app. So anybody that uses that and puts in their soil moisture measurements, then those models are going to make that prediction and figure out what your crop coefficient is on green 16 versus green 17 versus green 18. You just have to put the data in, right?
Exactly. Yep. So you just put it in, like today's moisture on the greens was an average of 18%. And you say, I'm going to put the greens, they're going to get 10 minutes of water tonight. The software even figures out then how does a certain quantity of runtime influence changes in soil moisture. So we generally think about this in inches or centimeters or millimeters per minute of runtime on a sprinkler head. But in the real world, we don't really care about that number. The number we really care about is how many minutes of irrigation do you need to increase soil moisture by 1% volumetric water content, right? And so the software figures that out. If we irrigate last night for 10 minutes and we expected it to be at 15% moisture, and that 10 minutes led to 17% moisture, and we didn't get any precip, all of a sudden now we know that our irrigation output is much higher than we anticipated. And again, the model starts to then hone in on what that value is. So we've been doing this now for whole areas like all greens. But the thing that we're releasing here in first quarter of this year is now we're running the models on individual greens or individual tees. Any area that you measure the average moisture in, you can put it into our CIS tool, and then it will show you when that individual green is going to wilt based on its location and the different factors that affect water use.
Nice. And that leads perfectly into what I was going to ask. at the end, which was what's next. Do you have any exciting developments that you can share that you've been working on of that sort?
Yeah, so this is 2025 is going to be the year of implementing our GreenKeeper Insight, our machine learning platform across all the different data. We started using that for some of our disease predictions with some lab data we got from the University of North Carolina State University, and we're going to see that insight being applied to clipping volume and green speed, where if you're giving it routinely entered data, we can then start building a customized model for you to understand how does your turf respond. And so this is stuff that Doug Soldat and his last grad student have been working on for a long time. We're finally able to implement it across the platform, and then continuing to bring sensors to the market to help with scouting. And then finally, that third part is bringing in the irrigation planning tool into CIS so that you can get real geospatial guidance as when do we think individual spots are going to start wilting.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing so much information. There's a lot of numbers in there and a lot.
Just a few.
Yeah, just a few. I think we always end up having a talk that's a little bit technical, but that's exactly what I wanted to know. So thank you for sharing all of that. Anything else before we sign off here, Bill?
No, I guess if you're curious about then the PGR scheduling aspects that we talked about, again, I have a blog at greenkeeperapp.com and the blog. Otherwise, please check out our Greenkeeper University course on scheduling PGRs, and you can learn more and more about how to use PGRs at your golf course.
All right. Well, thank you. And I will put a direct link to that in the show notes in the video description also, so everybody can check that out. And I will go ahead and say thanks for joining me, Bill, and I will sign off now for ATC from Trong, Thailand. I'm Michael Woods. Bye-bye.